Hello, everybody. Hope you're back. Hope all is going well with you. This is episode 3 in the series that I'm doing. And the series is about Israel. The reason is that since October 7th, when there was the incursion by Hamas into the state of Israel, with the taking of life, the taking of hostages, there have been all sorts of various reactions, and this is all over the world. And I'm of the opinion that people need to understand the facts of the situation. Now, I'm not going to be getting into the blow by blow details of October 7th, but just looking at the entire episode. And this really is just a continuation of the Arab Israeli war. It's really, truly, in my mind, what has been happening. But so many people are so confused. There are so many questions. And in the first 2 episodes, I was looking at the history of the land. Because in this series, I said I wanted to look at it from 3 perspectives. The first perspective being historical, then moving on to the legal status, and then finally the biblical position. And I understand that much of what I'm saying is controversial. There are no unanimous answers on any question concerning this issue, but I am giving you my perspective based on my understanding of what the actual facts of the matter happen to be. So, the first episode, going over the history of the land in very broad strokes, looking at the major powers, and the thing that I wished to point out was that there were the sovereign entities that no one at the time of their existence was questioning the legitimacy, the right, the authority of the powers that were in position. When we go into the second episode, I started to look more and give details concerning the 1800s going into the 1900s. And we concluded last time with the Ottoman Turkish Empire being the ruling authority in the land of Palestine. And the land of Palestine, although under Ottoman Turkish rule at the time, was really considered by the Turks a part of Syria. And there was no Palestine as we envision it today, the national movement that you hear in the news today. There never has been a Palestine. You look on any map of the world, and you would not find the Palestinian state on any map. But as we are at the end of the 1800s, we saw that there was the beginning of what is known as Zionism, and that is the national movement that arose looking for the creation of the state of Israel. It culminates, and we haven't got to 1948 yet, but we know that it culminated in 1948 with the then creation of the Jewish state that we know today as Israel. Well, with the 1800s, something that I had not included last time, but I believe is important and bears mentioning, is that we now start getting Arab immigration into the land. The first Aliyah, there were the 7,000 settlers making an agricultural community there in the land. And as we then go into the second Aliyah, the third Aliyah, we are finding that there is the uprising of a real, true, genuine economy that is making a difference in the lives of people there in the land. I as the kibbutz movement is growing, and they are not just simply taking care of their own needs there on the kibbutz, but they are also beginning to export. And there is the economy that is beginning to grow and thrive in the land. And there were then the workers that began to come into the land, and they were coming primarily from Yemen, from what we call today Iraq, from Lebanon, and these would be Arabs. Contrary to popular belief, excuse me, but contrary to popular belief, the Arabs did not have any sort of a sizable population in the land until the last 100 years. And by and large, the people that are there today and are saying that they are Palestinians, if you trace their ancestry, you're going to find that they have been in the land for the last 6, 7, 8 generations. And many are not even going that far back. So, there are a number of those that they're going back 4, 5 generations. But they don't have the 3,000-year unbroken history in the land that the Jews have. That, I believe, is important and is germane to this topic that we're seeing in the news today. Case in point, the PLO, which, if you remember, stands for Palestine Liberation Organization. The leader of that organization for years and years and years was Chairman Yasser Arafat. Well, if you look at Yasser Arafat's roots, he came from Egypt. So the native Palestinians, by and large, we're only talking about going back 8 generations or so at most. And that does not compare to the 3,000-year line of unbroken presence that the Jews have. As we then go into the 1900s, we get the building up to World War I, and that's kind of where we left off. The years are 1914 to 1918, and with that, we get World War I. With World War I, we are talking about many, many nations being involved in war. Now, this is somewhat unique because throughout history, just about any war that you could mention was limited. There were not allies of 20 nations coming together against another force. You just did not find that. And the wars that were being fought were local wars, regional wars. So, for instance, throughout the years, when you had in the Americas, you had the Mayan culture, the Aztec culture, the Inca culture there in Central America, South America. There were wars that were fought among the indigenous people of the Americas, but their wars, their fightings, did not have any impact on those that were living in South Africa, for instance. Well, when we get to World War I, we have this new phenomenon where there are a number of nations coming together to be aligned and fighting against another party of multiple aligned nations. And when we are talking about World War I, the combatants, we are talking about the Allies. And the Allies, World War I, there were a number of allies. I don't remember the exact number. I believe it was about 47 nations were in some sort of an agreement to some degree forming the Allies. But you think primarily of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan. They were the allies in World War I. They were fighting the Central forces. And the central forces were made up of Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. They were allied, and the war was on a number of continents. Well, during World War I, England, the United Kingdom, they had very much the interest in the Middle East, if for no other reason, the Suez Canal. And they wanted to maintain control. And so they are looking to do what is within their power to have the influence there in the Middle East, especially what is known as Palestine. And they had the desire to court whoever was in the Middle East. And so what we find is that with the peoples, they were looking to a two-state solution to who would be in Palestine. They were looking to the Arabs being especially in the Arabian area. And there is the birth of the national movement for Arabs. It's called Pan-Arab, the Pan-Arab movement. This is taking place. So we get into the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And so England was saying that they were in favor of having an Arab state. And in return for recognition of an Arab state, they wanted the Arabs to fight against the Ottoman Turks. With Zionism rising, World War I, there was a gentleman, Chaim Weizmann. He came up with synthetic acetone. He is Jewish, and the British, wishing to court and favor Jews, their thought was, in America, Jews are very strong and important, and if we come out in favor of Zionism, this growing movement, the American Jews will put pressure on their government, and we will then have more of a presence in supporting Zionism, that we will get support for our fight against the Central Powers and have America come into the war on our side as well. So they were saying that we favor an Arab state and we favor the formation of a Jewish state. Now, with this, we're going to find that there are two competing views. We go, and on the Arab side, in 1915, there was correspondence between the British government, one of the representatives, McMahon, and the Emir of Mecca. And he was saying that they were in favor of having an Arab state. And we're going to then see that in today's conflict, it is stated that there was the intention of having Palestine as being an Arab state, and that goes back to the correspondence which was there in 1915. That was Sir Henry McMahon, and it was Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Those of you who are familiar with your history, Sharif Hussein was very much in favor of having a pan-Arab movement, and the British were courting that. So they will look and they will talk about the correspondence between McMahon and Sharif Hussein. For the UK, the Arabs are to have a state that is east of Transjordan per Henry McMahon, the one that was in correspondence with Sharif Husseini of Mecca. There had been dispute following the war, and he wrote on the subject, stating that very specifically, the land to the west, what we would know today as the state of Jordan and the state of Israel, that was not included in the negotiations with the Arabs about the formation of an Arab state. This was done backdoor diplomacy. It had no legal standing. And there are those that would look and claim that as the basis. But the areas of Syria and Palestine were specifically omitted from the discussion. Likewise, there was the Balfour Declaration saying that the English were very much in favor of having a Jewish state come into existence. And that came in 1917. The Balfour Declaration. This was likewise backdoor diplomacy. It was not legally binding on anyone in any way, shape, form. And that was between Arthur Balfour and Rothschild, an influential Jewish businessman of the time. So, with that as the backdrop, we have the thoughts, the negotiations, the backdoor diplomacy for two states. And then the war comes to an end. Now, as the war comes to an end, the resulting cleanup following the war, and this is true of any conflict anywhere throughout history, once the fighting stops, there has to be the reorganization of normalcy of life. And there is the cleaning up of whatever details have resulted as the fighting raged for however long it lasted. And that is going to be true of World War I. The difference here with World War I is because it was on a scale and magnitude that had not been experienced previously in history. And so, with the cleanup following World War I, we get the Paris Peace Conference. And this was in 1919. World War I ended in November of 1918. So basically, the year 1918, those are war years. That's a year of fighting. And the coming together to, okay, now what are we going to do with the peace? That happens in 1919. The Allies are to remake the map. This was the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire comes to an end. There are the lines to be redrawn on the map as the forces deal with the peace. And they first dealt with Europe. Now the Allies, many nations among themselves, they decided that there would be a lead delegation of 5 nations. Treaties were signed, and with the signing of treaties, that means that there is international law now being involved. And another important thing around this time, and somewhat associated with the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, is that we get the formation of the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations is the idea of that instead of these regional fightings and conflicts, there is going to be a place where the world can come together to discuss problems, issues, and settle conflicts before they escalate into war. That had never happened before. So we now have a world organization for the conducting of affairs between nations arising, and that the League of Nations, we are now starting to get into the area of international law. That is an area most people have no comprehension of, and I'm one. I'm not an expert, but I do know that a lot of what people assume to be binding international law is not. But nevertheless, we are now getting into the issue of nations cooperating, nations recognizing rights and conducting affairs based on law. Now, the thing I want to point out is that the Allies have a 5-nation delegation with the legal authority to make decisions. That's very, very important to keep in mind. They're dealing with Europe in 1919, and of course, there's more than just Europe that's affected by this. And so they postpone taking care of issues until 1920 for other parts of the conflict. However, they also decide that there are the rising powers, the rising forces of the Middle East that are making claims. They have desires. They want rights to be recognized, and they are told to present their claims before the conference. And there is an Arab delegation, there is a Jewish delegation. They're to present their claims. Something that many folks do not know is that at this time, the Emir of Mecca, Emir Faisal, he met with Chaim Weizmann and they signed an agreement. Article 3 of the agreement that these two parties signed, they cited the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration, when it was first being presented in 1917, had absolutely no legal authority. No one recognized it. But with the Arab Jewish delegates coming together, signing this agreement, they based part of their agreement on what was in Balfour. And so the Balfour Declaration of 1917 is beginning to take on more significance, as there are those that are aware of its existence, are in agreement with what it states, and are using it. And we're going to see that the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into documentation that had international legal binding authority. But it was Article 3 of the Emir Faisal and the Weizmann Agreement that they signed, and in it, the Arabs claims that they support the Jews, the Jewish claims, and the Jews claim that they support the Arab claims. Well, the delegations presented their claims to the Paris conference, the 5 delegates that had the legal authority to make decisions. The Arab claims were presented February 6, 1919. They presented their claims first. Then the Jewish delegation presented their claims February 27th, 1919. I want to reiterate once again, the Arab delegation with their claims also said we support the Jewish claims. The Jewish delegation said these are our claims and we also support the Arab claims. And the Arab and Jewish claim by the agreement of the Emir of Mecca, and that is the Emir who is known as the father of the Pan-Arab movement, Emir Faisal, Chaim Weizmann. They were not in conflict in terms of their claim, so they were not claiming the exact parcels of land. It was not the same parcels of land that they were claiming. That document was saying that Palestine, especially what we know west of the Jordan, was to be Jewish, and the claims for the Arab state were actually east of what is current-day Jordan. But the claims were presented 1919 to the Paris Peace Conference. They took a break, the Paris Peace Conference, and they reconvened in 1920. And this is vital, in my opinion at least. In the town of San Remo in what is Italy, there was the reconvening of the delegates, and they adopted a resolution giving legal status to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And with that resolution, that moves this from backdoor diplomacy, moves it from discussion, moves it from a movement of people that this is what they want, and we are now in the realm of international law status. So, if someone asks, what is the birth certificate for the current state of Israel? The answer is 1920 San Remo Resolution. And so what that means, and I want to bring back one of the common things you will hear today, is that the Jews are a foreign people who, based on colonial powers, took land away from people and gave it to the Jews, and that is compensation for the Holocaust. And I had said earlier in my presentation that I believe every word of that is false. One, because the Jews are not foreigners to the land. And I think we show that by the 3,000 plus year unbroken presence of the Jews in the land. You cannot call them foreigners. Two, the recognition that there will be a Jewish state in Palestine was not compensation for the Holocaust. Because if you check your history, San Remo 1920 happened before the Holocaust. So it cannot be as compensation for the Holocaust. But that is San Remo. And in that resolution of 1920, not the entire, but there were the parts of the Balfour Declaration that were included in that resolution. And therefore, those parts of the Balfour Declaration are now elevated to the status of international law. This was agreed upon by the world community per the League of Nations, 1920. Come 1922, the League of Nations, not only is there the resolution, they say, and we are going to take steps to ensure that this comes to fruition, it becomes reality. And we find that the League of Nations, come 1922, by that time, they had ratified the British mandate for Palestine. Now, with the mandate, there were two mandates. People are most familiar, they hear about the British mandate. Very few people will recall that there was also a French mandate. And what is the Middle East? Well, first of all, let's go over what the mandate is. And I think from a legal point of view, and we are now transitioning. Now, of course, this happened in history, so there are still the historical aspects that we'll touch upon, but we are now moving into the legal, which, if you remember at the start of my presentation, I said I wanted to look at this historically and I wanted to look at it legally. And we are now looking at the legal precedents for the state of Israel. Legally, in today's world, think of a trust. A trust is a legal arrangement where there is an entity that comes into existence. And with that entity will have many times someone who is an agent for the trust. Now, what is the job of the agent? The agent is not there to create the trust, annul the trust, amend the trust. What the agent is supposed to do is carry out the specifics of the trust. And that's a mandate. Legally, the British mandate and the French mandate, France was named as the agent for what we call Lebanon today, and the British were the agent to carry out for Palestine. And the thought was, we have these new states that are coming into existence. We have these peoples, these Arabs, these Jews. They are not really ready for self-governance. And so, with the Jewish state, Palestine, the British are going to act as the stewards, the agents, and run things, make sure that there's electricity, to make sure that the phones are working, to just do the everyday working that needs to be done in life, and to carry out whatever the specific arrangements of the trust or the mandate happen to be, until such time as the Jews are ready to govern, and then the British mandate ends and the Jews will be their own people in Palestine and conducting their own affairs. That's the issue of the mandate. That's what the British mandate was. British mandate did not last very long, but the League of Nations ratifies the British mandate. Therefore, the resolution that had been in San Remo is elevated even higher and now has international legal status, and the Balfour Declaration is incorporated. Well, right from the start, there were problems, and there were those individuals, those parties that were not in favor of what was happening. Not a big surprise. I cannot recall any political situation where everybody is 100% in agreement on everything. And there was disagreement over this particular occurrence. So this came a number of Arabs that they were not pleased. And the gentleman, and a name from history, Winston Churchill, under the British mandate, the lines for Jewish Palestine were drawn, and those lines were land both east and west of the Jordan. And so that is legal standing, that what is east of the Jordan is going to be part of the Jewish state that had international legal status. Because of the unrest, and I'm not going to go into the history of the mandate years, but there were a number of conflicts, and there was a civil war, if you would, within the land of Palestine. And you had the Arabs that were inciting riots against the Jews. There were Jews that were striking back, and the British are trying to hold and keep peace in the land. And the British themselves were attacked at various times. And Winston Churchill, he is there in the government. He is looking at this condition that's going on in Palestine, and to appease the Arabs and bring peace to the land, he created the white paper. And with this, 80% of the British mandate was chopped off and taken away from the Jews and given as an Arab state. What was cut off is what is today the modern state of Jordan, and the amount of land that was taken away from the Jews by the action of Winston Churchill. 80% of the Jewish land was taken. Now, there is the resolution from San Remo, the ratification creating the British mandate. England is named as the agent for the mandate. Remember that the agent is not supposed to change, make, nullify any of the arrangements of the trust of the mandate. Winston Churchill indeed did that, and he did it unilaterally. And what he really did was a violation of law, because the agent is not allowed, does not have the authority to change a trust, to change a mandate. But that is indeed what happened. So, the British, they see that we are the agents, and per the League of Nations international law, there is the land that is recognized and given Jewish authority. The agent then illegally changes the mandate and takes away 80% of the land. No one complained. No one said anything, and it was just what happened. Well, we then are moving through the mandate years, and the League of Nations, for various reasons, comes to an end, and the League of Nations gives way to the United Nations. We have the United Nations even to this very day. And the United Nations is the international forum for the world to come together to talk about projects, for nations to try to take care of problems and issues before they escalate into war. The United Nations comes into existence in 1945. Well, one of the things that the United Nations did was to recognize the authority of the League of Nations. And they did that by assuming whatever the League of Nations had done previously, the United Nations declares that is what we are continuing, and what the League of Nations did was right and binding, and we are continuing it. So what was binding under the League of Nations will also then be binding under us, the United Nations, which means that the treaty that was signed at the end of World War I, where the Turkish Ottoman Empire came to an end, Turkey signed a treaty giving up their rights to the area. And they gave their rights up to the Allies. The Allies then have the legal right to make decisions about the land of Palestine. Within the Allies, they then have their treaties that they signed saying that these 5 nations would be able, and Britain was one of the 5, that they had the legal right authority to make binding decisions. This is now international law. Under the auspices of these 5 delegates, they make decisions that is recognized by the League of Nations. Therefore, it is legally, internationally binding. It is law. What then transpired under the League of Nations is then transferred to the United Nations. The United Nations say we are going to continue this, so therefore it is legally binding on an international basis. 1947, the United Nations, they make a partition plan. And in 1947, there is the vote that there will be 2 states. But with these 2 states, the Jews lost even more land, not just the 80% that they lost from Winston Churchill, but for the Arabs, more land was taken away from the Jews. 1948, the British leave, and the Jews declare the rebirth of Israel. And the Arabs, and there were a number of Arab armies, immediately within 24 hours attacked the Jews. In spite of what everyone on planet Earth believed, thought, this war, and it's referred to as the Jewish War of Independence, 1948, the Jews won. Everyone thought that the Jews would be eliminated, wiped out immediately. But it didn't happen that way. So that brings us up to 1945, the United Nations. And another reason why I say that original premise of that the Jews are a foreign people that have no legal right there to the land. They were given the land by colonial powers as compensation for the Holocaust. As I pointed out earlier, the Jews are not foreigners. San Remo, the recognition of a Jewish homeland, was before the Holocaust ever occurred, so it could not be as compensation for the Holocaust. It's not the colonial powers, because it was the League of Nations, then likewise supported by the United Nations. And if someone wants to say that Israel just had the colonial powers, do you say Russia was one of the colonial powers? Most people wouldn't say that. Well, Russia, 1945, with the formation of the United Nations, Russia is included as one of those nations, and the 1947 vote for the creation of the state of Israel, Russia voted for. And it wasn't just Russia, it was the majority of the nations of the world that were participating in the United Nations at that time. So with the United Nations partition plan that was voted on in 1947, it can legitimately and legally be said that the world voted for the creation of the state of Israel. Were there those that were opposed? Of course. You don't get 100% agreement on everything from everyone. But the majority of the world said yes, the vote passed, and 1948, the state of Israel declared its rebirth as its own sovereign nation. That is per law, and it is legally binding. I believe that what has happened, and this is something people need to give consideration to, is that because of political expediency, legal decisions were set aside in this matter of this nation of Israel. We're going to continue. Thanks for listening up to this point. God bless. See you next time.